Boatworks Today is a viewer-supported show. To learn more on how you can get involved and watch extended ad-free versions of these videos, please visit our website, boatworkstoday.com, and click on the top of the heading where it says Support This Show. Thank you. What is going on, everybody? I hope you are doing well. My name is Andy with Boatworks Today, and I had to pull a little bit of an audible this week. So my original plan was to get started on the Bertram, but there was a small delay in getting the materials in that I needed as far as my resin and glass and all that stuff. So, which is no big deal. You know, that's fine. It's not a big deal. But it mean I had to kind of change things up for this week's video. So instead I thought I'd put together a video that actually I've been meaning to do for over a year now, primarily because it's a question that's been brought up pretty consistently, especially when I'm doing any kind of a painting project-based video, which is what kind of spray system am I using? How do I deal with the fumes? What kind of gun am I using? You know, and along those lines. So basically, when you're looking at different types of spray gun setups, there's a handful of different options. There's HVLP, or high volume, low pressure, they also kind of clump that in along with like turbine systems, turbine systems. There's also LVLP, low volume, low pressure. There's airless, and then as you get up into more of like an industrial type setup, there's the option for doing like pump systems. And then lastly, there's just the old school traditional spray gun. Now, when you're looking at these different options online and you're looking at the specs, there is, in my opinion, there is a lot of marketing hype that kind of comes in, and it's primarily when you're talking about high volume, low, or HVLPs or the turbine systems. The marketing twist that they put on these HVLPs is that you have better control, you have less overspray, and so in turn you're going to have less of a mess, and you're going to use less material. And that's kind of sort of true. It's more of a half-truth, I guess, in my opinion. They're a good gun for certain materials, don't get me wrong. They're, in my opinion, where they primarily shine are when you're spraying materials that don't need to lay down in a perfectly smooth finish. But also, kind of the other part of that equation is specifically when you're spraying materials that actually have some flow time to them, like varnishes or lacquers, so that when that material hits the surface of whatever it is you're spraying, you have 15, 20, 30 seconds for that material to kind of flow and level out. Now, when you're talking about spraying paints, you don't get that flow time. You basically, when the paint comes out of the gun, if it's not atomized enough, you're going to get what's called an orange peel, or a really funky looking surface. And the reason that happens is because you're just not able to get the amount of pressure that you need at the tip of the spray gun. There's a reason that HVLPs are called high volume. You can put out a lot of material, but it's low pressure. It's low pressure at the tip. And that's where you run into problems when you're talking about spraying paints. Now, in my opinion, the best gun to use when you're talking about spraying Awlgrip or Interlux or any type of marine paint where you're looking for that absolutely perfect, pristine finish is an old school conventional spray gun. High volume, high pressure. This is not a sponsored thing. I'm not trying to pull a sneaky Pete and try and get you to buy something or anything like that. I'm just sharing what I ultimately found to be the best gun for my situation. So what I ended up settling on, the actual spray gun itself is made by DeVilbiss, and it is a JGA 510-765 with a 1.1 millimeter needle, and it's hooked up to a 2-quart Binks pressure pot. Now you can't really see I don't think you can really make out the name because it's covered in paint, but it's a Binks 2-quart pressure pot. And then for the air supply, I have everything hooked up to, it's a 3-horse Ingersoll Rand compressor sitting on top of it's a 60-gallon, basically a pressure accumulator tank. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this because this is another question that comes up is, well, how much air how much air volume do you actually need to drive one of these guns? And my unit, like I said, it's a 3-horse on a 60-gallon tank, and that is just barely enough to actually run this. Ideally, I should be playing with a 5-horse. The 60-gallon tank is fine, but the amount of air volume that my compressor is actually able to put together, and most 3-horse compressors, It's usually varies somewhere between 10 to 12 CFM. And that's, like I said, bare bone minimum. Ideally, it should be closer to 16 or better. When it comes time to upgrade, I'm going to be needing to look at a unit that can put out at least 20 CFM. So my system, it goes from the tank to a regulator that basically it pulls the moisture out of the air lines from the compressor. But it goes from the tank to a regulator, and then from the regulator goes into the line that feeds the spray setup. So when I was originally running this off of a 100-foot line, I was just the pressure drop was way too much. If I had my regulator cranked all the way up at 120 psi. So before I pulled the trigger on this gun, I was getting 120 psi to the gun. But as soon as you pull that trigger, it would drop right down to say 30 psi, and just nothing works at that pressure. Not even primers. So not good. So swap that out for, I think it's right now it's a 50-foot airline, same diameter, and because it's half the length, I didn't get quite as much pressure drop. Now, even on that compressor with that shorter line, maxed out, again, regulator completely cranked all the way up, I can maintain about 60 psi at this at most. And it works, but just barely. Now, when I'm talking about being able to actually maintain adequate pressure at the gun, what does that really mean? So it varies depending on the material that you're spraying. Like for when I'm spraying primers, my air pressure at the gun is going to be lower than it is if I'm actually spraying paint, just because it's a little bit of a thicker material and it builds faster, so it doesn't need to be broken up as fine. So when I'm talking about primers, typically I look to have the pressure at my gun at 45 psi, and I can verify that, because I've got an actual pressure gauge right here at the gun. So hopefully this doesn't squirt. Okay. So basically what that means is that when you pull this trigger and you're blowing out your air and everything, you want to be able to look at this needle and see that it's holding at 45 psi for primers. Now, for paints, as I had mentioned there, they typically run a little bit higher pressure. I will run that usually between 60 to 65 psi. Now, because of the setup that I use and the pressure that I have to run everything at, there's quite a bit of overspray, and there's just no way of getting around that. So because of the amount of overspray that I have, that brings up the question, well, how do I manage all of that? And now, granted, I'll show you here in a minute, but my setup here, it's a commercial setup. Now, but you can still take the concept and apply it to more of like a DIY situation if you were going to be, say, working out of a garage, or even maybe not so much outside. But if you're trying to get a small boat painted, inside your garage, you can apply these same kind of concepts to your situation. So in the back of the shop here are my two primary exhaust fans, and if I remember right, I think they're each 24-inch fans, and between these two, they move about 6,000 CFM or cubic feet per minute. So these guys are moving some air. Now, after running some quick and dirty numbers here, the work bay, or the main shop that you always see in the videos, is roughly 28,000 cubic feet. Now that's not square feet. That'd be huge. So in the summertime, these two fans do a pretty good job. I can just open some windows, and about every 4.5 minutes, give or take, then 100% of the air in this work area is evacuated. Now, that doesn't work so great come wintertime, because I don't want to be pulling all that freezing air back into the building. So let's head upstairs and we'll check out the air makeup system. So I don't think I've ever shown this back room here, primarily just because it's storage and it's always just such a disaster. It's a mess. But anyway, so this is where the air makeup unit is. And basically the way that this works is it draws in fresh air from outside, runs it through these 3 chambers. Now, one of them is a big burner, and then I think the other 2 are just giant fans. But so it brings the fresh air in, heats it up, blasts it up through this ducting, and then finally kicks it out back into the main shop area. And the blowers on this unit were basically set up to match the exhaust fans. So the exhaust fans are pulling 6,000 CFM out of the building, and then this unit is pumping in 6,000 CFM of heated fresh air back into the building. So essentially the way that the system is working is that it's circulating the air in the shop in kind of a counterclockwise rotation. And with everything fired up, within the matter of about 4 minutes, give or take, 100% of the air in this building gets completely exchanged. It gets pulled out, the fumes get pulled out, and I have fresh air pumping back in, through that inlet. It works out pretty slick. Now, as far as the way that you could apply that same kind of concept, to a DIY situation, is, it would be pretty difficult to supplement, a heat supply or a heated air coming into a garage. But if it's in the summertime, you could basically put in a couple of box fans, stick those in if you have any windows in your garage or a door or whatever, have one pumping air in and the other one blowing air out. Now, because this isn't a perfect setup, and I don't really know if there is such a thing, but it's not it's not a filtered paint booth like you would see for like cars. I mean, it'd be pretty difficult to get a paint booth large enough, to fit a 40, 50-foot boat. I mean, they are available, they're out there, but I don't have 7 figures to dump into the system where I paint 4 or 5 boats a year. It's just it's just not going to happen. So you make the best with what you got. But because I realize that also plays into what type of paint I use when I'm spraying. Specifically, I want to be able to be using a paint that I can come back and I can do a cut and buff. So basically, if there are any blemishes or imperfections, any specks of dust, I'm able to come back in, wet sand those out, and then buff those out to a perfect finish, so that when it's all said and done, you're left with an absolutely perfect mirror finish. So again, the paint that I'm most familiar with is Awlgrip or that line of paint. So when I'm spraying, rather than using Awlgrip, which is not a paint that you can wet sand and buff, the other paint that they offer is called Awlcraft 2000. And so almost exclusively, that's the paint that I use, just because I know that in areas there's going to be dust. I mean, it's just unavoidable. So as a DIY working out of a garage, in my opinion, personally, I think you should be looking at a roll and tip, just because unless you're really set up with the adequate size compressor and you want to make the investment into this type of a gun or spray setup, you're really going to be best off rolling and tipping. But if you already happen to have this equipment, or for the most part, come time to be spraying, I really, really recommend that you use a line of paint that can be wet sanded and buffed. Now, Awlcraft is not the only paint. I believe Interlux, they're one-part paints, I believe, can be wet sanded and buffed. And there's also another line of paint which I've not used, but it's one that I'm really, really interested in, and it's made by, I think it's Alexial. But the main reason I'm kind of interested in giving that paint a try is, regardless of how you apply it, whether it's rolled or sprayed, it can be wet sanded and buffed. Now, that's kind of the trade-off with Awlgrip. I'm kind of going off a little bit on a tangent here, but that's kind of the trade-off with Awlgrip. Awlgrip, the actual true Awlgrip paint, can be rolled and tipped or sprayed, but it cannot be wet sanded and buffed. Now, Awlcraft 2000, that's a spray-only application. You cannot roll and tip that. So it's a spray-only application, but it can be wet sanded and buffed. Now, what makes this kind of this Alexial, I hope I'm not getting this confused with Amazon's Alexis. Their paint, you can apply it either way. You can either roll it or spray it, but you can also wet sand it and buff it. So that kind of has a little bit of an edge over Awlgrip. But again, I haven't used it. I would like to, but so far at this point, I have not. So at this point, I think I'm going to end this video here, just strictly because I could go on and on about how to set up the gun specifically, as far as getting the air pressure right and the flow and the fan width and how far to hold the gun from the surface. And honestly, if I were to go down that road, that's actually, there's enough info there for its own video. So for right now, I'm going to kind of call this like a 101 spray gun setup. Specifically, I'm just covering my particular setup just because it's what I'm most familiar with. But hopefully you found it helpful. If you have any questions, comments, please leave those down below. Specifically, if you'd like to have me go through and cover how I set up the gun as far as, like I said, the air pressure, flow rate, fan width, that kind of stuff, let me know, because I am going to have a paint job coming up on this Bertram here before too long, and I can certainly put that information together. So if you'd like for me to do that, please let me know down below in the comments. And have a great weekend, and until next time, thanks for watching.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.